Let's take a quick look at creating a course that is inclusive of multiple stories, truths, and personhoods. Let's look at culturally responsive teaching. First, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that UNCG sits upon the stolen and unceded land of the Kiawe and the Sara. I ask that we venture to honor them in our work together today. To get us started, I need us to think about what makes student success possible. Vince Tinto is probably one of the most well-known scholars in student success. He, along with George Koo and Alexander Aston, have argued for a number of years that the number one indicator of student success in the classroom is faculty-to-student contact. And this includes both formal and informal interactions. So when you say hi to a student in the hallway, you can have a significant impact. The second indicator of student success is peer-to-peer. Both of these mean that how you set up interactions in your courses is essential to student success. If a student feels excluded in your course, doesn't see themselves in the content you present, or if they're harmed by the language or actions of others, they'll shut down and write you and their peers off, thus eliminating the number one and number two indicators of student success. So it's important to be intentional about the materials you select, the activities and examples you use, and how you address comments and acts that happen in your course. This intentionality allows you to address issues of equity and inclusion with learning at its intent. Foundationally, let's look at microaggressions. There are a number of definitions for microaggressions, but I like to use this one adapted by the University of Washington. It's everyday harms that are both verbal and nonverbal, intentional and unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages targeted at a person's identities and or based solely upon their membership in a marginalized group. The important piece is that microaggressions don't have to be overt or intentional. These unintended actions can cause just as much harm as intentional ones. So when these happen in our courses, both intentional and unintentional, verbal and nonverbal, when these harms happen and we don't address them, students write us off, which is the number one indicator of student success. They write the faculty member off. And then they'll write off the person who caused the harm, which if it's a fellow student, that will be their number two indicator. This prevents not only the student who was harmed, but others from truly learning in the space. And also, if a student inflicted the harm, they could be isolated by their peers, which also does nothing to help them grow as a student or change their future actions. So when we avoid addressing microaggressions in our courses, we can do a lot of harm. It's important to just take a moment and say, wait, something just happened. Let's address it. Even if you don't know 100% how to address it, acknowledging that it happened can go a long way. So where do you start? I like to start with intentional design. Thinking about how we structure or develop our courses and our teaching methods can go a long way to creating an inclusive space for our students. Here are a few examples of how to do that. First, in teaching strategies, avoid making assumptions about anything. Avoid making assumptions that students know the examples you're going to use, the histories you might reference. Really don't make assumptions about even who a student is or what they bring with them to the classroom. Also, use inclusive language. Think about how people identify and the ideas that might be present in that space. How are you going to be inclusive of all of those pieces? Demonstrate a commitment to how community is built in your classroom. Talk a lot less, which can be hard for many of us, me in particular, but you have to talk less and you have to role model and practice active listening. Help your students define what active listening is so that they can better learn from each other. And also, you got to cite personal examples, not just from your own observations, but encourage your students to bring their own stories forward. Additionally, I have to diversify the learning activities and point of views present. I have to remember that all students don't demonstrate learning in the same way. You've got to use real and current examples, not abstract what-ifs. You need to give students choices in the activities and the ways they proceed in their learning. You got to provide space for reflection. And most of all, remember that practice is practice and reward risk-taking and learning. One of the biggest challenges I find is that we often grade homework as if it's the final end-all kind of summative assessment, and it's not, it's practice. So thinking about how you intentionally provide feedback for practice is important. Here are a few things to keep in mind as you go forward with your own strategies. One, we are products of a power over culture. That is just the nature of being in the academy. These are colonizing practices that are ingrained into our culture. Now, not every one of us is going to go out and change the system, but being aware of this power over culture is important. Here are the components of what makes a power over culture. It's a heavy focus on things like perfectionism, power hoarding, a sense of urgency, quantity over quality, that there's only one right way, paternalism, there's a defensiveness, there's worship of the written word, there's belief in only one right answer. It's either or thinking. It's a fear of open conflict. It's focused on individualism. It's belief that I'm the only one that can be right in this situation or do it right. It's a belief that objectivity exists, and it's a claiming a right to comfort. Those can be sometimes hard to hear, but there are things that are very much present and that we reproduce in the academy, and it's important to be aware of them. 2, we also have to acknowledge that the way we measure learning in itself is limiting and dismisses the knowledge that is essential to our students. I like to look at the work of Tara Yoso. Yoso's work began by examining the experience of Latino, Latina, and Latinx students in education. She realized that the way we measure and document learning often disregards a significant amount of wealth our students bring with them. By doing this, we ignore a great deal of knowledge and experience, and we hold some students as unprepared simply because we are not accounting for the full picture. Yoso's cultural wealth model seeks to account for more than the student's ability to repeat content and to move us to a more inclusive demonstration of learning. The model is inclusive of 6 capitals. Linguistic capital, which I like to think about as the wealth of being able to code switch between languages, modalities, and dialects. Thinking about the energy and effort it takes for our students to do that quickly and often. Familial and social capital, the role of family and friends and peers plays an essential part in the learning process. Navigational and resistance capital, the ability to navigate and persist within systems that are shaped by colonizing and institutionalized inequity. And aspirational capital, remembering that hope is an essential component of the learning process. Now, how do you start these conversations with students? I like to start with how to create this inclusive space, and I start with ground rules. You need to help students understand that this space from day one is one where they're valued, and here's how we're going to demonstrate that to one another. I like to start with the work of Claude Steele, and this shapes my conversations with students. I start with this question: what guidelines can we agree upon now in order to create a learning environment in which we can ask each other anything? Now, this may feel slightly uncomfortable, so you don't have to use this particular phrase for you, but for me it gets at what are our ground rules? What are our deal breakers? What can we ask and what can we not to really get us to a place of learning? Now, there are a few things I have to keep in mind as I go through this process. I want the students to be an essential component of how these ground rules take shape. So for me in my classes, I actually have the students make a list of what it would look like for us to be able to ask each other anything. And we develop our rules from there. But here are a few guidelines to keep in mind that I've learned along the way. 1, don't use the language of safe space. This really should be reserved for spaces of treating trauma, like counseling and healing circles. We're only trying to create safe enough space, as Michelle Tanaka calls it, safe enough for us to share and learn together. It's essential that I include my students in this process in some way. So for my courses, it's easy for me to have my students do the whole process together. but you may be in a larger course or a course where this doesn't feel as comfortable. And that might just simply mean that you ask your students to weigh in and edit existing ideas. But it's important that they have a chance to make decisions about what the ground rules of this classroom will be. You will have to reframe non-specific behaviors. Students like to say things like, "We'll show each other respect," not realizing there are cultural implications for that. So be very specific about, well, what actions demonstrate respect? I mean, eye contact does not mean the same in every culture. So how do I help my students begin thinking about that might not be the best way to show that we're actively listening? And I have to develop a way for my students and for myself to redirect attention back to the rules. Sometimes it's saying, "Hold up, that didn't sit right," or even a timeout sign, "Let's talk about it," or just, "Let's remind everyone to go back to the rules we agreed upon." It's whatever our students need to be able to do this. Additionally, you have to establish for students early on what it is that you want for them in classroom conversations. The idea that discussion, dialogue, and debate are different and that I need to convey that to my students was mind-blowing in my own teaching. It changed how I approached everything. I have to help my students understand what I'm expecting and why. Debate has its place in the classroom, and I can run a structured debate to cover things as long as it meets the outcomes that are useful for my goals. Discussion is much more in line with the idea of having students reflect on scholarship, asking, what do our readings tell us about this topic? And dialogue is much more inclusive of sharing experiences and ideas. Now, I have to remember this as I develop activities, because if I don't set these ground rules, I could very well end up with all three of these things happening at once, and nothing happens positive in that setting. But what do I do then when something happens? When something is said or harm is caused, how do I handle that in those hot moments? Because it's going to happen, even if my course isn't focused on equity and inclusion. I like to start with a simple introduction for my students on day one to what is intention and what is impact. We all have intentions, and they don't always align with the impact of our words or our actions. So helping students unpack how to ask questions is essential to helping them build a community of trust and learning. I like to use the following activity. Now, I also use this activity with faculty, so some of you know where I'm going with this. But I ask students to think about how they respond to an action that causes harm. So let's say somebody said something in class. Is your first thought, what a jerk? Or is your first thought, I wonder why they said that or did that? If your first response is, oh, you're a jerk, I make them go to one side of the room and say, you're my impact group. If their first response is, why? I make them go to the other side of the room and you're my intention group. Now, I acknowledge for my students, this is a dramatic oversimplification of really what this is. Many of us fall in the middle. I can both think someone is a jerk and ask why they did something. But for the sake of this example, I have them pick a side. And then I say, let's pretend someone said, I don't see color. Now, those of you in my impact group, I want you to list every positive intent this person may have had. And if you're in my intent group, I want you to list every possible negative impact. And then we discuss. What this does is it starts a conversation where students see that this is not simple. There is a lot of gray, and that we're all coming at this from different intentions, and we need to get at the why as much as we need to address the hurt. But we have to address the hurt, and we can't ignore it. I like to use this example of I don't see color because it is bound to be said in one of my courses, and I can take it off the table in a structured way that is a lot safer for my students. But I can't just point out intention versus impact. I have to give them tools. So how do you get to the bottom of this? Well, first, I like to give them the 4 C's that sustained dialogue developed. So someone said, I don't see color. Let's stop and ask for some clarity. Why did you say I don't see color? Maybe the student came from a racist family situation and wants to be clear that they're not the same. Or maybe they're trying to say that color shouldn't matter. Or maybe they are clinically colorblind. But it's important for us as a group to get to that reason. And if my students talk in generalities like, well, I assume or I've been told, you've got to redirect them back to some personal examples. What have you seen that has led you to believe this? And then I have to create a space for others to react, because if I don't create that space will create itself. And I need to be really clear. How are others feeling? I can look around the room and see that this didn't land well with some folks. How did that make you feel? Right? Give them an opportunity to address it. And more importantly, if my students all come back and say, it didn't really bother me, I need to tell them why, right? I need to tell them that saying I don't see color has dramatic impacts on people of color, that it tells them that their histories, their stories, and their truths are invalid. I have to provide my students for the context for why that caused hurt and harm. I also like to provide my students with something called the ladder of inference. To me, it's like the scientific method of how we get to an action. It starts with an observation, right? Something's happened or I've seen these things and I make a selection, a data selection on what I'm going to use to move forward. And that leads to my assumptions, brings me to conclusions, shapes my beliefs, and leads to actions. So if I can walk a student back down that ladder, I can really get to the root of why they've made the decisions and choices that they just came through with. I also like to think about how I set up my course to make sure that I have the foundations of culturally responsive teaching. Number 1 was establishing ground rules. Number 2 is helping them develop a positive attitude about their learning experience in the space that we're in. That includes learning contracts, creating experiential activities. I also have to help them deepen their learning, right? Enhance the meaning of the things we're doing. And that can be done through projects, case studies, and simulations. And I've got to think about these multiple modes of learning in that. And lastly, I have to help them engender confidence in the learning process. Give them spaces to demonstrate what they've learned through self-assessment, portfolios. There's a variety of ways to do this. This is a very quick overview, and it might not have felt quick. It's over 17 minutes, but trust me, it is quick, of how to begin thinking about inclusive strategies for teaching. In the UTLC, we offer a number of programs that can help you go deeper in each of these and get you started. But remember, you are the #1 indicator in students being successful in your classroom. So thinking about these things and being aware of these things can make a huge impact.